Hello and welcome to another episode of Garden Chores with the Comox Valley Horticultural Society. Today we're at Frank's garden and he's going to tell us all about pruning roses.
Thank you, Gordon. Just for full disclosure, I want to say that I am not a rosarian. I'm not an expert who raises beautiful roses for display, but I do have half dozen roses that I've had for well over 15 years. And I get them to put on a fairly good display. So I want to share my knowledge on pruning with you on that. But if you're looking for some more expertise, I'm going to suggest a book by Bricknell and Joyce. It used to be considered the Bible for pruning, and I believe it's still available. And so I could suggest those for people looking for more information specifically to the type of roses they have. Thank you. And we'll go now and we'll start by looking at the tools you need to do a proper pruning job. Okay, I've brought some tools here that you should be using if you're going to be pruning roses. First and foremost, gloves. I mean, these are nasty plants with nasty thorns, so you want to be prepared. So have a good pair of gloves. These are actually electrician's gloves, but they work fine. You can get fancy gardening ones, I'm sure, just for pruning. For the pruning itself, we use bypass pruners. This is your standard Felcos, I think they're called. I've had these for many years, and they're a bypass. You want to keep these sharp, so make sure they're sharpened and clean, because you don't want to be spreading diseases. So I use a little bit of alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, after using them. Just spray them and wipe them down. Other people use bleach. There's various other disinfectants you can use. For the big stuff, a pair of loppers. These are just like the bypass pruners, but bigger. After we're done, we've got a little bit of cleanup. So I got a rake to sweep up the leaves, and a little bit of fertilizer. And these are Epsom salts, which contains magnesium, which I find works well on roses. Fertilizer, I don't have the proper rose fertilizer, which hanging around right now, so I didn't bother buying any because I had a bunch of all-purpose 686. But if you use the proper rose fertilizer, these numbers here would be far greater. The last two, which refer to the phosphorus and the potassium, so those numbers be larger, and that encourages your blooms. Your first number is your nitrogen. That's what gives you your foliage. So if you don't have rose fertilizer, you can probably get by with this, but don't use something like grass fertilizer, which would have a huge first number, because you get lots and lots of foliage but not many blooms. So with that,
So a question, Frank.
yes.
So what you're going to tell us today about the pruning and the care, would that hold true for roses that we have in pots?
Depending on the type of rose, yeah.
Okay.
But the mini roses, probably a little different. What I'm going to be looking at here is what's called the modern roses. So there's three basic groups. There's the hybrid teas, the floribundas, and the grandifolias. And these are similar in that they all are grafted roses. So the rootstock is on a semi-wild rose, and then the beautiful flower is on the top. So I'm not sure, I don't want to make a broad statement about pruning other types of roses. What I'm going to do here definitely does not apply to your climbing roses.
Okay.
And doesn't apply to your species roses like rugosas, which you were asking me
Right.
about.
Yes, which we have.
Yeah, and because those are, like the rugosas are what's called a species rose, so it is not a grafted rose. It has the same rootstock as it does the top foliage.
Okay. And they're very abundant in their growth.
They're very tough rows, so
Yeah.
it's hard to hurt them. I mean, highways uses those to plant beside highways or in medians.
And I
So
think
they're-
they have worse spines than these. So it's
They do. You can look at them and see them right away because they have much more spines and they're sharper than this.
Yeah.
But saying that, they need very little in the way of pruning, and it's dead easy
Yeah.
for those. So if you're hesitant about getting a rose because the pruning scares you off, get a rugosa, a species rose. Dead easy.
Perfect. Okay. So Frank, as we prepare to get started to prune our roses, perhaps you could explain when we need to be pruning our roses.
Sure. You want to do the main pruning in the spring, late winter or early spring, but it varies a little bit depending on where you are and where your rose is situated. So the old adage was you prune when the forsythia is in bloom. And that's a general statement. It works to a certain extent, but you want to be careful with it because depending on your rose, you know, the forsythia may be in bloom earlier or later on when your rose is starting to grow. So use your rose, look at your rose and see what's happening. In this case, you can see the buds are breaking out, the leaves are in places almost there, and we're only in the very beginning of March. But this rose, saying that, if you look at the site, it's against a house with a southwest exposure. It's under an awning. So this is a very protected rose. So when really means depends a lot on when your rose is last going to be susceptible to a hard frost. These are protected. I'm not worried about hard frost now, so I'm pruning these probably earlier than most people would prune their roses. But really it depends on when your last hard frost is.
Okay.
And what the rose itself is telling you in terms of breaking out, buds bursting out.
Okay. And the why of it all.
Why? Yeah. There's a couple of good reasons why we prune our roses. Of course, the obvious one is you want to keep it the shape and size you want. And in doing that, again, remember our climate here on the West Coast, very wet. So we want to keep the rose itself open so it's less susceptible to fungal diseases. Roses are notorious for getting something called black spot here on the coast because it's so wet. So when we prune it, we want to keep it fairly open. We don't want it too bushy. So we want to keep it open for that. Another reason we prune is that these modern roses are all grafted on a rootstock of a much tougher, wilder rose. Occasionally these will come up, and if you don't prune them back, that will take over your plant, and that beautiful rose you had will come a rather drab flower. Sometimes it's red, sometimes it's not too bad, but it'll be very different from the rose that you bought. So you want to make sure you get on the rose right away and get those off, the suckers. They're coming out of the root or below the graft area. So if it's coming down way down low, it's probably a sucker and you want to get rid of it. Does that explain why we're pruning?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so can we start?
Indeed.
Okay, so the first thing and the easiest way to start pruning a rose is the basics. Dead, dying, diseased, and weak branches. Those all go. So let's get rid of those and then we can have another look. So I see some dead stuff here. Take that out. There's another couple of dead shoots here. Keep those out. I've got some really weak stuff here. Just a very strange looking branch heading straight down and around. Let's get rid of that. And another one coming up real low that may be a sucker. That's where your suckers would come, way low on below the graft. In fact, if you want to pass me my loppers for this so I can get a better cut on it. Thanks, Gordon. Okay, I don't Here's another few really weak ones, shoots. Generally the rule of thumb is if it's smaller than a pencil, take it off. So we've got a couple of two really small shoots there, so I'm going to take those off. Find where they join up. Oh. Okay, that's got rid of the, oh, one more dead branch I see here. So we've gotten rid of the dead and the weak. Now we want to look at opening it up, and this is where some people get scared, because the rule is you always prune to an outside bud. So what do we mean by an outside bud? We mean one that's pointing away from the center, not pointing into it, because if it's going into the center, you get something like this, which is a crossing branch. You can see that's growing in, so it's going to cross another branch and it's going to cause friction and possible damage. Plus we want the center somewhat open. So those we want to get rid of, anything that's going to lead to that. So I'll be cutting these back, taking out some of the larger shoots and leaving some of the smallers. Now, one thing I should mention is in our pruning is an attempt to add vigor to the tree or the bush. And roses produce their best blooms on newer wood. So you always want to get rid of the older, the biggest shoots that you have there and encourage the younger, newer ones, because they're going to produce the best roses. So, let's start here. So we can see the buds, lots of nice buds here, here. I don't like this because it's growing right into the center. So I'm going to cut this back here. Now, you see where I've cut it? The buds are a little bit below that, about a ½ an inch below it. And these are pointing out this way. So this is two good directions. This way towards the house and out towards the path. Those are good directions for those future growth. So we're happy with that. Now I've got another weak one here that I'm going to cut off because I think it's just a little too weak. Now I've got two branches, two shoots here, which are somewhat similar, both pointing in the same direction, both good branches, but I don't want too many. So I'm going to take this one in the center off. Wait a minute. Yeah, I think I'll take this one off and we'll leave this larger one.
You want your loppers?
Yeah, I think the loppers would make it a little easier. Now I should say this rose is called About Face, and it's a grandiflora. And this grows a little bigger than your hybrid teas. So I am not cutting it back as much as I would a hybrid tea rose. And then I'm going to cut this back just to this little branch that's coming out, because the bud here you can see is pointing in a good direction, not in but out. So that's good. Now I want to open this up a little bit, so I want to take away some of this center growth. I'm thinking I'll take away maybe the largest one here. Still have lots of good, vibrant shoots. But the younger ones are far better, and that they'll produce a better rose. So I'm just going to cut this back a bit. Okay. Now, some of the rose manuals you'll see they're big on the angle of the cut. I'll just try and explain that. Yeah, let's see right here. They'll say you should always cut at an angle so when the water falls it comes off the pruning cut. So the angle is such that rather than cutting it straight across, you cut it at a bit of an angle. And I suppose it's okay, but I wouldn't pay too much heed to it, personally. Okay. Just want to count these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Just going to cut this back a little bit. And this one I've cut. Again, here's the bud, the direction I want it to come. Outside, not inside, so I'll just cut above there, just slightly above, 1/4 of an inch maybe. And a little bit of an angle so the water runs off, if that makes you happy. I don't think it's as important as some people let on, but nonetheless, that's what many of the guides suggest. All right. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're getting there. Okay, I'm going to cut. I don't like this guy the way his branch is going, so I'm going to cut it off here. And we'll cut his branch here back to a outward going bud. Again, here you can see the way this bud is going. It's right to the interior, and because it's the topmost bud, right now it's the most vigorous. So if you let it go, it's going to grow there and it'll be crossing all these other branches, covering over the center of the tree. So I'm going to cut it back to a bud that's growing away. So you can see here, the next bud down is going in the direction I want, which is away from the center, right here, rather than towards the center. So just above there, give it a cut. There we go. And we're just about done here. I'm just going to make this a little shorter. The way that's pointing. I don't like the way that's pointing. So I'm going to go back to the smaller bud here. Cut it to there. All right. One more stem I want to bring back. You can see this is growing right into the house. Not very good. So I am going to bring it back quite a bit more. This is too high, and hopefully we'll get something coming out in a good direction. And lastly, this fellow here. Good. And that's about it for this rose. Now, if you're a real rosarian, you would take it down much lower, but they're looking for individual blooms that have the long stems and the perfect blooms. I'm looking for a rose that has many blooms, and so I haven't cut it nearly as far back. There's something to it.
So, Frank,
Yeah.
so you've pruned quite a bit off this rose.
Yeah.
And I'm going to suggest that we might come back in the middle of July and we'll just maybe see how much growth this has put on, and
Well.
if people get worried about how
Oh,
much
yeah.
they're taking off, then you know, they can see for themselves that, you know, these things really do bounce back.
Yeah.
And
I suggest you come back a little bit before that to see it
Oh.
in full bloom in June.
well, we can do that too.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier about some of the diseases that are susceptible to. You mentioned black spot.
Yeah.
I know our roses get powdery mildew on the
Yeah,
leaves
that's
as
another
well.
fungal disease.
I have heard or read somewhere that you shouldn't let dead leaves collect underneath the roses.
That's right. Because they can harbor that sort of fungal disease. So I'm going to, I've got a pile here started already, and all these trappings are not going into the compost pile. They're going into my garden waste can to just keep it clean around the rows.
And what about mulching now around roses? Do you tend to mulch them in the wintertime?
Not in the winter time so much, because what you want to do is not get them so wet in the winter. But in the summer, yeah, you could put a little mulch in there.
Okay.
And I'm going to add a little fertilizer once I'm finished this. So just before when you do your spring bloom, you know, that's when they're putting on growth. So give them a shot of fert at that time. And then the second time you really want to give them the fert is after that first big bloom is over. You know, these roses are made so they'll bloom continuously, but you always have a large first bloom. So after that is over, give them another shot of fertilizer. Feed them when they're hungry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you've got another one to show us to prune, so we can get on to that.
Alrighty. Okay, I'm working on a different plant now, different rose. So I'm just going to give my tools a quick spray with the alcohol and a wipe down, so I don't spread anything from one rose shrub to another. Should be fine. Now this rose is a beautiful rose known as a blue rose. It's called Blue Moon, and it produces quite an interesting light blue mauve type flower, and I've had this for quite a few years. So I'm going to start same thing as with the other rose, taking off the very weakest, any dead, dying, crossing branches. So the 3 Ds, dead, dying, and diseased. And to add to that, a D word for weak. You got to think of that. Good. We'll make it the 4 Ds.
4 Ds, okay.
So I have 3 branches here that are obviously very small, very weak. The rule of thumb is under the size of a pencil. So these come off right away. 1, 2, 3.
So Frank, would those have been new growth that just came on too late last year?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. Does that
Or
make
they're
sense?
just weak?
And yeah, they're just weak. That spot. So I've got a few crossing branches here, right from the center. So this crosses the whole bush. Not a great thing. You want your branches on the outside to keep the center fairly open, to keep the air in there, and thereby reduce any chance of fungal infections. And I won't say get rid of fungal infections, because in this climate it's almost impossible to have a rose totally free of something like black spot unless you're willing to spray it with a fungicide every second day. But you certainly can reduce the chances of it getting into a serious problem. So I'm going to got some good branches here. I'm going to cut them slowly down right away. Here's the bud going in the direction I want, away from the center, so slightly above it. Make a nice cut. There's where the branch is going to go. I'll do the same thing on these. I don't think I need both of these though. And they're just crossing, so I'm going to get rid of this one. That's not a very clean cut, so it tells me that these have to be sharpened soon. Actually, Gordon, I'll get you to pass me those and I'll make a better cut on this little stub I left here. I've made a bit of a mess here. What you want is a nice clean cut rather than something like that, but we'll get back to that later. We don't have to show that on the film, just ignore that. Move on here, move down here again to a bud that's pointing in the good direction I want, outside, so a quarter of an inch above it, snap. That looks cleaner, that's better. So this part of the rose looks pretty good. So I've got a very old branch or shoot here, and you can tell it's just much bigger than the other ones, and the color much lighter than the vigorous light green of the other shoots, and it's right in the center. So I'm going to take this off now, and the reason being, again, I'll repeat it, is that roses grow best on the younger growth, on the younger shoots. So things like this versus big old branches like that. So got another crossing branch here that I don't like at all. Comes right across. So I'm going to take that out. This is a lot easier. You can see how we're opening up the center. That lets the air in and makes it less amenable to many of the fungus pests that prey on roses. So again here, pruning this back to a good bud that's pointing out and away. Here the same thing. And here I'm going to cut this to a branch that's pointing that way. And I'm going to bring these down a bit. Just seeing where the buds are. One's pointing in. I've got one here that's pointing out. And bring this down. Some of these buds are very small. You can see like something like that. But once you remove the top, a bud like that will swell up and you'll get it doing just fine. But you can always tell where the buds are. You have this little scar where the leaf was. So even though you can barely see the bud now, there is going to be a bud there. The buds towards the top always emerge first, and they'll be the dominant ones unless you cut it back, which is what we're doing. Okay. So that's about it. I'm going to take off some of these old leaves that made it through the winter. These are harbingers of disease and fungi, which we don't really want, so cut them right off. And I'm going to finish up by doing a little cleanup around the plant and giving it a little dose of fert. Okay, I'm just sweeping up all this old foliage from the winter. Dead foliage. These could be, and probably are, host for various fungal diseases. So we'll clean up a little bit around the base of the rose, make sure there's no old leaves on it. And then we'll give it a little shot of fertilizer. I'm going to give it about a quarter of a handful, maybe a bit more, better than a half a handful. I'll work in around it. And then that's it until it blooms. After blooming, you'll want to deadhead it, take away the old blooms, and then in the fall, what I do, if you look at this rose here, I have not pruned this for the spring, but this was winter pruned in the late fall because the rose was probably 5 feet high, 6 feet high, and very prone to damaging winds and snow. So before the really bad weather comes, you want to just take it down a little bit, a foot or two, so it doesn't have big floppy growth that'll get blown around and possibly damage either the root or the rose itself. So that's your next little pruning in the fall. Okay, I'm just going to give this a little bit of fertilizer, probably about a handful or half a handful. Spread it around, and like I say, you can get the actual rose fert, which has the higher numbers in the phosphorus and potassium and smaller nitrogen. I just have some all-purpose 686, which I'm going to use today. And of course, you can also use organic fertilizers, are good too. And I'll just work that in a little bit. And then I'm going to give this a water, and you're going to say, oh, you must be crazy. You're watering it after we had last week. Well, this is actually undercover here. So the soil is actually quite dry, which is great for overwintering the rose. But now that you want it to start growing, you want to let it know, give it some fertilizer, some water, and make conditions right for fast, vigorous growth.
Frank, it's always a pleasure to come and have you share your knowledge of gardening with us. And today it was roses, and you've done a spectacular job. And as I say, we'll come back in June when they're blooming and when they put on a whole lot more growth, and we'll just see what they look like.
Very good. You're always welcome.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you.